Well, good morning.
Good morning, Jimmy. Welcome.
I remember a couple of years ago, well, it was more like 10 years ago now, first time I was visiting a family, and they showed me these new earphones. And I remember putting the earphones on, and I was able to, I think, watch a movie or listen to music, whatever it was they were showing me, and it was crystal clear. I was like, this is amazing. Blocked out all the sound, and it just sounded so great. And then I remember them saying, now watch this. And they did something, they clicked a button or something, and all of a sudden, I could still hear the music, still hear the sounds, but it was like someone was playing it in the room. And I could hear everyone talking, I could hear all the sounds in the room, and so I was amazed at this new technology. Pass-through technology, they call it. Nowadays, it's pretty common. I think most people are like, when you get your headphones, you look for this pass-through. It's pretty common with most headphones or earphones these days. Some people, as I saw it, it's like, wow, I need to get myself a set of those headphones. I need to get some of those, earpods or whatever it was. Until you look at the price, like, wow, that's pretty incredible. And then you're like, I don't need it that bad. Some of you are thinking, man, some of you might not even be aware of that there's this pass-through technology that's pretty common nowadays, and you might think, I need to get some of that for church. As we sit here in the mornings, there's a lot of things as we recognize we're trying to listen to the word of the Lord, and for each one it's different. Some of us, we have a challenge with our voices, and it's natural. Some of us have louder voices. I remember once in a Bible study on a Wednesday night, someone had to be like, Jamie, shh, you're too loud. It was in a living room. Some of us, when we whisper, you think you're whispering, but you're actually talking at a level that's pretty loud, and you're not aware of it. Others, they have problems hearing. They would just like this technology so they could put it on their ears and maybe just be able to focus on the lesson and have it pumped through the microphone, and they can block out the other sounds, because some of us, our ears aren't that good. There's some people that have to sit underneath the speakers so they can hear better. And others, we have a challenge being distracted. As we try and listen, the slightest little thing will distract us. Actually, studies have been done back in 2013 and 10, 11, 12, 13. There was a lot of studies done, even the differences with men and women and the sounds of babies. And they discovered certain cries that the babies made. A lot of men, they could just block it out. They didn't even notice it. But the women's wavelengths in the brains changed a little bit when babies were crying, and they noticed a difference between how we respond. And that can be true in other situations where some of us are able to block out sounds better than others. And I know when my wife, she's like, doesn't that bother you? That noise in the background at the neighbors, maybe a party going on, or maybe there's, a lot of noise going on, maybe even on a Sunday morning. And I'm like, I don't notice it. How can you not notice what's going on? It's so loud. It's coming through the wall. I don't notice it. I block it out. He says, well, that explains why when I tell you something when we're driving or something like that, you maybe block it out too. Anyways. These are real factors. That's why when we come to church, it's difficult for some of us. We're all different. And so we do our best to try and help one another along so we can hear the word of the Lord. Now, I'm not saying this morning to say, if you're hard of hearing, you need this, or if you're a loudspeaker. I'm not doing that to say this. But what I wanted to relate it with is this saying that Jesus gave. For those of you who have ears to hear, let them hear. And that's a really strange saying, because Jesus said this a number of times. For those who have ears to hear, let them hear. Why would you say that, Jesus? What else are ears for? Do you greet each other? Let's put our ears together. Do you smell things? That smells great. You put your ear down. No, we don't do that. So why would you say, with those who have ears to hear, let them hear? What else are you going to do with your ears? And Jesus said this a number of times in Scripture. Here's just a few examples. Just a few. Let anyone who has ears to hear listen. Let anyone who has ears to hear listen. Let anyone who has ears to hear listen. And Jesus said this far more than 3 times. He talks about this quite often. And as a matter of fact, this is really talking about something deeper than just what you do with your ears. It's talking about your heart and your mind. It's talking about your desire to know God. So some of us are sitting here this morning and you're maybe like, Okay, here comes Jamie. It's sermon time. Time to check out, right? And listen, if you're checking out because of me, I need to know that. Maybe we need to get someone else in here. I hope it's not me. And if you're checking out maybe because it's hard to hear, that's different, hard to understand, that's different. But if it's because of God's word, you're like, I don't agree with this stuff, I don't like this stuff, you better listen. Because people back then didn't listen to Jesus, and there was a lot of trouble that came in their lives later on. You know, there's a Old Testament, when the Lord of armies says, make fair decisions, show faithful love and compassion to one another. Don't oppress the widow, the orphan, the fatherless, the resident alien, the visitors, or the poor. Do not plot evil in your hearts against one another. And it says they refused to listen or to pay attention. They turned a stubborn shoulder. What did they do? They closed their ears so they could not hear. How do you close your ears? Maybe someone's like, I can do it. And you can like concentrate. I don't know. Some people can like wiggle one ear and, you know, whatever. Maybe there's a way you can close your ears. No, I don't think so. How do you close your ears? You stop paying attention. And that's what this is talking about. So guess what? They stopped paying attention to God, and God stopped paying attention to them. And their lives did not go very well. God would not listen to their prayers. And I guarantee you, even those who don't believe in God, they need God at times in their life where they'll be praying to God, and they'll wish I had listened to God so He would listen to my prayers. Well, Jesus is hinting at this. It says, they closed their ears so they could not hear, and they made their hearts like a rock, so as not to obey the law or the words of the Lord. You know, you can make your heart like a rock. How does that happen? Well, Jesus hints at this, and we read this story. This is a story of Jesus going to synagogue, like a church service. Let me just show you one other passage. If anyone has ears to hear, let him listen. And he said to them, pay attention. That's what having ears to hear means. Pay attention. That's what having a soft heart means. Your heart is open to God. So Jesus goes into the synagogue. This is on a Sabbath day, on a Saturday. Sabbath was the seventh day, the Saturday. Technically right now, Sunday, this is the first day of the week. Not Monday. Sunday is the first day of the week. Today. And so, there he was on the Sabbath day. They went to synagogue on the Sabbath. That's one of the things they did. They worshiped God on the Sabbath. Now, it's interesting that the work they did around the Sabbath and around sacrifice, and that wasn't considered work. Walking to the synagogue, that wasn't considered work, even though the Pharisees at that time had a lot of legal laws around what you could do or couldn't do on the Sabbath day, because God said, keep the Sabbath holy, don't work on it. We'll talk about this. So there's Jesus. He's in the synagogue. And it says, a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The scribes and Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. See, Jesus had already done this. He had already done what they considered work on the Sabbath day. So they were watching him to see what he would do. But Jesus knew their hearts. He knew their thoughts. And so he told the man with the shriveled hand, get up and stand here. So he got up and stood. Then Jesus said, I ask you, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil, to save a life or to destroy it? And after looking around at all of them, getting them, are you thinking about this? Are your ears open? Are your hearts soft? Because you need to listen. And then Jesus said, stretch out your hand. The man should have said, I can't do that. But he was able to stretch out his hand. He did it, and his hand was restored. They, however, were filled with rage, and they started discussing what they might do with Jesus. Actually, they didn't just discuss what they might do with Jesus. They discussed how they were going to kill Jesus. What Jesus just did, was that worthy of death? Helping someone who was not able to use their right hand all their life, and he healed it and restored it, something that no one could do. And that's worthy of death. I want you to look at how this is recorded in Mark and Matthew. Matthew says, he gives another detail with this story. Matthew says, Jesus replied to them, "Who among you, if he had a sheep that fell into a pit on the Sabbath, wouldn't take hold of it and lift it out? A person is worth far more than a sheep, so it is lawful to do what is good on the Sabbath." In other words, you people think you're keeping the Sabbath by not working, but if it's for your benefit, you will work. If you're about to lose a sheep and that's going to cost you money, you'll take that sheep out of that pit because you're worried about your money. Shouldn't you be more worried about the person who is in need? Shouldn't you be willing to help that person out, even if it's on the Sabbath? And if you don't get it, you don't know what the Sabbath is about. That's essentially what Jesus is saying. But the Pharisees went out and plotted against him, how they might kill him. And Mark tells us Jesus looked at them in anger. After looking around at them with anger, he was grieved. Why? At the hardness of their hearts. He was grieved at the closing of their ears. He couldn't believe that they weren't listening. They weren't open to it. Jesus was angry and sad. And the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill him. This wasn't the only time that Jesus tried to heal on the Sabbath. There are a number of other times. Peter's mother-in-law, the lame man at the pool of Bethesda, the man born blind in Jerusalem, the woman with a bad back from an evil spirit. That was also in a synagogue. And the man who was ill in the Pharisee's house. That was on the Sabbath. And the demon-possessed man in Capernaum, which we looked at a couple of weeks ago. So Jesus did this a number of times, and these times he was trying to teach them something about the Sabbath. Now, let's take a look at the Sabbath. The Sabbath was a part of the Ten Commandments. And what's interesting is why the Sabbath was brought in. Why did God give them the Sabbath, this day of rest? It's talked about in Exodus and Leviticus, and then in Deuteronomy, Moses repeats the command, and he shows them the why. And Moses says, "Be careful to remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. You are to do your labor 6 days and do all your work, but on the seventh day is Sabbath to the Lord. Do not do any work. Your son, your daughter, your male, female slave, your ox, donkey, all of your livestock." This was a rest day. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. When you were in Egypt, you worked hard all the time. Remember, you were a slave. The Lord brought you out of there with a strong hand. That is why the Lord has commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Because you know what it's like to be enslaved. You know what it's like to not have any rest. You know what it's like to have a tough life. But when you follow the Lord, if you follow him, the Lord will bless you. And it wasn't just with this one day of rest. Do you know the Lord blessed them in many ways? He blessed them with, after 7 years, don't work. You don't have to do any farming. The land will give you, you'll be able to reap from the land 3 years worth of crops. So you could take a whole year of rest basically if you're farmers. That's crazy. What? Just like God provided manna, God would provide for them on the 7th year, every 7 years. And guess what? Every 49, 50 years, 7 times 7, you have the year of Jubilee. My kids know about the year of Jubilee. I remember they were fighting one day about who owned what and who paid for what. I forget what it was about. But I just remember this big fight, and I said, well, guess what, guys? This is the year of Jubilee. We're going to let it all go. It goes back to the original owner. We're canceling that debt. We're going to forgive him. We had a little study on what the year of Jubilee was. Because every 50 years, the year of Jubilee, if you bought land, you had to give it back to the original owner. If you were a slave, you were set free. I mean, the year of Jubilee was a year of celebration. It was a year where injustices were reversed and where people would go back to the original. It was a year of forgiveness. And some people believe that when Jesus came, Jesus is proclaiming the year of Jubilee eternally. You see, as they were enslaved in Egypt, God gave them the Sabbath. And the Sabbath was a reminder of freedom, was a reminder of rest. Not just the Sabbath day, but every 7 years, every 49 years, the Passovers, there was a lot of rest God gave. But that was only an indication. It was pointing forward to the eternal rest that God would give. You see, God is the God of rest. And when he created the garden and we put Adam and Eve in there and he rested them in that garden and blessed them. When that was taken away because of sin. And we live in a world where we sin, where there's evil and darkness, and we look forward to being taken into an eternal rest. Jesus was trying to get them to see that it wasn't just about the Sabbath, there was something more at work. And so in Mark chapter 2, Jesus tells them, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. It was given to you because it's good for you to understand rest. But understand this, Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. What? You're equivalent to God? That's essentially what he was telling them. He was telling them that he and the Father are one. They instituted this, and now Jesus is showing them something different. They are no longer under the Sabbath. So if you're wondering today, do we have to keep the Sabbath day? That was a part of the first covenant. And we could go back, and for time's sake, I didn't include these passages. You can do a Google search. You can just do your own research. They broke that covenant. They could not keep those Sabbaths. If you didn't keep the Sabbath holy, guess what would happen to you? You were to be stoned. You were to be killed. It was that important. But God overlooked that because they couldn't uphold it. And they failed to even give the land rest. And guess what it says? When they were taken away by Assyria into captivity, and the land got its Sabbath rest. And so there's many passages that show that they failed to keep the covenant. They failed on their part. And so what does Jesus do? He comes to make a new one. And that's what we did with the Lord's Supper. Take this blood of the new covenant in my blood. It's a new covenant that we're under. And so we're to remember that while rest is good, we look forward to an eternal rest. And that's what the Hebrew writer tells us in Hebrews chapter 4. Therefore, a Sabbath rest remains for God's people. This is an eternal rest, one that was to come, because they never got their eternal rest. They never really followed the Sabbath rests. Therefore, a Sabbath rest remains for God's people. Let us then make every effort to enter that rest. We seem to make every effort to enter a rest for ourselves. I mean, I think about how much time and energy we put into our schooling, our education, so we can get a good job and save some money. And everyone that I worked with when I was working in the factories and when I was working on different jobs, people are always talking about retirement. They can't wait. They're looking forward to I'm doing everything possible to retire as early as possible. And so we work really hard for our own rest. How hard are we working for the Lord for our eternal rest? You know, we put so much time and energy into our own education for our physical benefit. How much time are we putting in for the spiritual benefit? And I'm not saying for our own, because that would be like working to be saved, or that would be like being greedy. But there are others out there who don't know. There are others out there who are enslaved. They don't understand freedom. They don't know. They're like the guy with the shriveled hand, doesn't understand what it means to be able to use that hand. They don't understand freedom. And Jesus, even though he came for what? He came to work. That's what Jesus said in John 5. My Father is still working. See, on the seventh day God rested, but it wasn't over on the seventh day, was it? We sinned. And so God the Father had to put into effect the plan and start working again. Working to send his only Son to die on a cross so we could be redeemed and we could have eternal rest once again. You see, it didn't end at everything was very good and God rested, but then God had to continue working again. And that's what Jesus is showing us. Jesus is showing us, my Father's still working and I am working also. He came to earth with a mission. He came to earth and his work wasn't easy. It wasn't like, well, I'm just, I got a job here. I got to construct a bunch of things so everybody has a trinket before I leave. That's not what he came to do. He came to give his life for us. Now, did Jesus still rest? Yes, you need your rest. But this isn't a story this morning about the Sabbath rest. That's not what we're talking about this morning. I mean, we're learning a little bit about the Sabbath. But Jesus, the other side of it is that Jesus was working. And he did this multiple times. Because it's better to do good on the Sabbath. And so here we are, and we can have our rest, and we look forward to rest, but yet we also have a job. Our lives aren't just about, oh, thank you that someone taught me about you, Lord, and then we go and retire and live our lives on a private island and never worrying about the work that Jesus has given us. We are his co-missioners. We have been commissioned to go out there. Commissionaries, to go and do the work that Jesus came to do. Moses understood there was something more coming. The Hebrew writer says about Moses, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, for he considered reproach for the sake of Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. The rest he could have had being in the palace, being wealthy and resting. He could have had that great rest. Instead, he's out there shepherding on the run, and he lived a terribly difficult life as a shepherd and shepherding God's people in the wilderness. But he knew there was something greater coming. The Apostle Paul, he could have retired as a wealthy, he was a Pharisee, maybe like an attorney. He would have been making some really good money. But he said, I have considered all to be, whatever was gain, I've considered to be lost because of Christ. I consider everything to be a loss in the view of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus. He wants to be found in him. He wants to be worthy. He wants to honor him. And you know what Jesus says as he tells us what the greatest, you want to have a soft heart? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbors yourself. Remember when that rich man came to Jesus? Teacher, what good thing must I do to have eternal life? Why do you ask me about what is good? There's only, then he goes on to say, if you want to enter the life, keep the commandments. Which ones, he asked? Do not murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness, honor your father and mother, love your neighbors yourself. I have kept all these, young man told him. What do I still lack? Really? Are your ears open? Is your heart pliable and soft? A heart of flesh? Because if so, go sell your belongings and give to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. Jesus knew that this man's heart was on the wrong thing. That this man's focus was on the physical, not on the spiritual. And he went away sad with great wealth. And of course, Jesus says, he puts it plainly, as Luke records, every one of you who does not renounce all his possessions cannot be my disciple. If we're living our lives for this rest, and you'll have your rest, just like if you equate time as money, that treasure on earth. If you're living your life for treasure on earth, you're not going to have that treasure later. If you're living your life for rest on earth, you're going to miss that rest later. It's a story of balance. You do need rest. If you leave a bow always tightened, it weakens the bow. Or a spring always compressed, it'll weaken the spring. Sometimes you have to take the pressure off. Jesus, don't get me wrong, Jesus had days of rest. Rest is important. And that's why the Sabbath was made for us. It's good to have our rest. But it's balance. Some of you may have seen, there's a video going around the internet. I don't know why anyone would try this, but it was this teeter-totter. And there's 4 people, and they keep balancing one another as a bull runs around trying to hit them. And everything's good because they jump up and the bull goes under and the other person balances, and they keep going up until one person falls off. And guess what? 2 people get gored by the bull. Not killed, but they get thrown and hurt probably. Anyways, the story is a story of balance. So we've been given our lives. We've been given our possessions. We've been given our time, your health, whatever you have. Are you using it all for yourself? Or are we trying to understand that there is a great mission that God has given us to go and make disciples? And if we understand that, are we willing to give up some of our rest? Are we willing to give up some of our possessions? Are we willing to give up those comforts that we want so dearly so that we can show God? Our ears are open. We hear the need that you have for the lost to be saved. And we want to go out there and bring you glory by making disciples in this world. May God help us in our mission. May God help us to have open ears at all times, and for our hearts to be soft, our ears to be open, and may we hear what he's teaching us as we try and bring him glory and show him that we're willing to give up even some of our comforts in life for the sake of his glory in the gospel. Let's stand for our final hymn.